Thank you, Hannah. Hello, colleagues. It's a pleasure for me to share with you the content of the toolkit we have been working on in the two past years. It's mostly on the guidelines on the development of curriculum review on land governance. It's development, but also review of curriculum on land governance in Africa. I hope you can see my screen. So I will start by stating who this or to whom this toolkit is designed for. It is mostly designed for universities, for government, for civil society organization, for learning and research institution like yours. And it's really important to mention that you can also download this presentation as well as a toolkit on the homepage I will be highlighting later on. It's mostly a kind of summary of the 26 guidelines organized into some thematic areas. And we mostly highlighted some kind of experiences from some African countries. And it's also important to notice that Africa is quite diverse, and this toolkit was developed out of the experience we have developed or gained out of some 20 African countries. From a political perspective, it's quite important to highlight the fact that this toolkit is quite aligned with the AU Declaration on Land Issues, and it could also be used to better manage large-scale based investment and to provide some kind of policy guidance for for the government and also for research institution as yours. So before going deeper into the content of this toolkit, allow me to give you a kind of historical background on the guidelines. It's important to know that we started this process since 2007 to 2011, whereby some kind of regional assessment were carried out all over the continent. And to make it happen, we needed to collaborate with some African Land Policy Institute, with some regional economic committees, and we had to make sure also that the toolkit will be developed, it will be aligned to the need of the industry, because I hope that you understood that there is a kind of gap between the need of the industry and what is really part of the content of the university or the training centers. And later on, we have drafted the guideline itself during a kind of workshop, and we developed the curriculum guidelines itself in 2017, and this guideline was later on endorsed by the AU the same year. So here now there's a kind I'm trying to showcase the framework and guidelines on land policy, which mostly relies on 10 important topics that I will go through. It's really important, first of all, to recognize that land issues in Africa are unique and complex. It means that the way land issues are managed in Africa, you will not find it elsewhere. And it's also important, since Africa is diverse, as I mentioned before, to acknowledge the evolution of the land tenure pluralism in Africa. The way land tenure has been moving in Central Africa is different from the way it has been moving in Southern Africa or in Northern Africa. And it's really also important to underscore the centrality of land to Africa's socio-economic development and growth. And we cannot speak about land tenure system without highlighting the challenges related to women and land rights, and the fact that is quite important to ensure equitable access or ownership of land for every African citizen. And it's also really important to mention that while you are working on land challenges in Africa, you should consider the fact that the local contexts are quite different, even inside the country. And you should also try to find a kind of right balance between local contexts and global challenges and global standards. And of course, we are in a dynamic world. We have also to consider emerging issues related to land and to land resources. And to recognize the need for land professionals to have multiple skills. You cannot handle land only from a sociological perspective or geographical perspective. It's important to take into consideration this interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity while whenever you are dealing with land matters. And it's also important to appreciate the kind of opportunities offered by urbanization, and to understand that land is also the base of a lot of conflicts in Africa. JRC is a good example, but also in some villages you can have this type of challenges. And to take into consideration the principle of good governance, also there is this topic related to land corruption. I will not go too deeper into it. And lately to recognize that much of the land and natural resources is used as a common resources. So this is the toolkit. What I've just described it's been part of this toolkit. We'll go through the evolution of land governance in Africa. We'll try to showcase the need of the industries and how land should be governed from the rural areas perspective, from the urban to peri-urban perspective. How do we make sure that women's land rights are secure? What are the impact of environment and climate change on land management? The different strategy to be considered in the management of land conflict and land resources, the same with land tenure and property rights, and mostly in terms of research and innovation, and how do we make sure that we do operationalize all these topics together. So these are the different contents of the toolkit itself. So as I mentioned also, I will try to highlight here the evolution of land governance in Africa. So we try to go from the pre-colonial system to the colonial complex system put in place, and now to see what happened latest after the post-independence area for a better management of land to fight against inequalities. So in the pre-colonial context, it's really important to recognize that land was managed from a customary land tenure system, and it was mostly influenced by social, political, and economic formations from one context in a concrete context. And in the pre-colonial area also, it's important to understand how centralized and communal societies were organized to control or to have control over the land. And this has, of course, led to the emergencies of social classes, whereby those who were earning the land were considered as more powerful than those who were not having access to any type of land. And with the federal system of the pre-colonial Africa, it was also important to know that land was only owned by some kind of elite for the aim of generating some kind of revenue for themselves. And in this pre-colonial area, it's really important to also highlight the relationship between the laborers and the peasants to have access to the land. And of course, since it was a kind of feudal system, it therefore means that the decision-making process was mostly centralized by some family members, or in some other cases by some village council, and some priests had also a lot of power in these non-centralized communities. And it's also important to mention that an evolution of contestation of the power of this elite was observed, and this has also led to a kind of migration, coupled, of course, with the population growth from a geographical perspective. So it's important whenever you are dealing with this pre-colonial management of land system to recognize the communal land ownership and access among pastoralist communities, and to understand also the dualism of tenure introduced by Islamic regimes, especially in northern, western, and eastern Africa, with land subject to various charges and taxes. So the guideline 1 stipulates therefore that the curricula, in the process of reviewing or developing a curricula, it's important to have cognizance of the evolution of land governance, the emergencies of land tenure pluralism, and how all this relate to the contemporary realities in Africa. So in the colonial context, it's important to highlight the fact that the colonial masters brought or have tried to influence the land management according to their own realities. So it means that the way land was managed in the British colony was different from the way it was managed in the French or Belgian or Portuguese or Spanish colony. And it's also important to, in this process, to analyze the impact of colonial laws on existing customary and religious practices, leading to a kind of pluralistic land tenure system. To acknowledge as well three distinct colonial land frontiers: the settler colonies, the concessionary colonies, and zone of peasant production. You know that each of these zones were managed with quite concrete, on a quite concrete ways with different legislative systems. And also to learn about colonial land control through agreements. You also know this principle of land without masters, brought in place by Bismarck in the 19th century. And the different motivation to conquer new lands and to appropriate this land even with the force, mostly facing some kind of violent resistance. And also to understand how land was appropriated and allocated to settlers, mostly for agricultural activities, and with some kind of non-centralized political structures. It's also really important to recognize the dominance of peasant proprietors in farming activity in West Africa, who got transformed through indirect role for export for crop production. You know, most of these were for cocoa, for coffee, for cotton productions. And also to study the concessionaire system in areas with potential for investment in agriculture, forestry, mining, leading to exploitation by chartered company. So this, since it was a colonial system, of course, these companies were also colonial companies as well. And to understand the role of colonial administration in the land titling system, reserved for Europeans or for colonial master, imposing or undermining the impact of customary rights on the land. So close to the 1960s, a lot of African countries moved to the post-independence context in the land management system. And it was really important to understand the diversity of post-independence land tenure system influenced by the ideological path, including the free market approach of economies and some socialist, social communist approaches on management of land. And it's quite obvious that the introduction of colonial system in land management has created a kind of complexities on the understanding and the management of land, mostly related to the allocation, to the control, and to the access to this land, mostly to the fertile or arable land. So, and since a lot of countries or post-colonial countries just adopted the system they inherited from the colonial masters, it's really important to also know that there was this kind of impact of the Islamic law in the management of family right to access to land, and to acknowledge the adoption of this pluralistic land tenure system. It could be religious, it could be customary, it could be statutory in most African countries at the post-independence area. And it's really also important to know that former colonial laws often discriminated or highlighted discrimination against women, particularly in the rights in inheritance. This has been also fostered with the Islamic religion, or somehow also by the Christian religion. So you should focus, of course, on securing community lands right to protect from appropriation by state agency, to elites, to foreign investors. So it's a matter of equality, balanced access to the land, and to emphasize on the need for a reform for land in the land governance system, mostly via the review or the development of curricula to reflect the post-independence realities, which should harmonize the customary and the statutory land management system. And lately, to identify the post-independence issues like social conflicts, land speculation, land grabbing due to population growth and urbanization. So we will now move to the industry. What is the role of the industry? Why shall we be focusing more on developing a curricula? What are the requirements of the industry in this process? So it's really important here for the industry to identify the needs and gaps. It therefore means that each industry or any type of stakeholders from the industry which is willing to review or to develop his curricula should evaluate the current curricula, focusing on technical skills. Which type of skills are we trying to develop to acquire in this curriculum? And this goes through a kind of surveying, evaluation, or land administration, or planning. So all the different subjects are supposed to be deeply analyzed. Later on, you should go on in the access of the program, which type of skills should be developed in planning, in surveying, in land management, in law, and in social sciences. And mostly it's important not only to criticize or to analyze it, but to focus mostly on responsive, which type of responsive policy were developed or were brought according to the identified need or challenges. Which type of technology or services or and how efficient were these different strategy or tools developed, and also to identify open education resources relevant to the topic like GIS, land law, land tenure valuation facilities, and so on. The next step is mostly to plan for incremental improvement after the evaluation, and you should plan now on incremental improvement. This goes hand to hand with the kind of holistic approach to have a kind of broader thematic program within a discipline. So if you focus on law, you should also take into consideration aspects related to anthropology, to sociology, to geomatics, and so on, to make it to have a kind of broader understanding of on how law can influence the better management of the curriculum you're planning to develop or to review. It's also important to address the complexity and challenges in the land governance not covered in the current curricula. So it means you should do a kind of critical assessment of what is currently happening to see which type of improvement should be put in place, and to incorporate innovative approaches as well as methodologies and input from various scientific perspectives, from social scientists, but also from the so-called hard science, and to enhance, of course, understanding of land policies and laws and traditional land management, and to adapt and how it could get adapted easily to technology and to sustainable land management. The third step is to proceed with the review. So the review is an ongoing one. It means that if you have developed your curriculum for the need assessment, you should make sure that after 1 or 2 years, you try to review to make sure that it does fit to the current trends and challenges. So it should then be later on validated by some group of experts, mostly from the member state, which recognize themselves with what you are proposing. And out of this, I think this is what NTPS is already doing. You can develop some kind of short courses for lecturers and also for land practitioners with regard or considering also the technological advancement. And to collaborate, of course, with industry for research areas in higher education, and to identify relevant short courses according to the current challenges. So it's really important to review, as I mentioned earlier, the curriculum review, the curriculum, to ensure that it remains dynamic and that it does provide some kind of current answer to the challenges, and to make sure that there's a kind of balance review interval so that you can allow for lesson learning. So when you move from one curriculum to another, you should try to capitalize on the lesson learned from the former one, and to take into consideration the technological impact in the review of this curriculum. So this leads us down to the conclusion related to the second guidelines, it's really important for good results that the curriculum should be preceded by an assessment of the prevailing needs of the industry. You cannot do a curriculum review without going closer to the industry. The assessment should be undertaken as a collaborative effort between universities and industry. A clear research agenda on land governance ought to be developed in the universities. So the next topic is mostly on land governance in rural areas, and we will try to focus more on this part on marginalized groups, on large scale investment, on youth, on pastoral system, and also we try to question or analyze the urbanization, the impact of urbanization and commercialization on land management. So land governance in rural area, I will not go through all of it, but it's also important to recognize African ecological diversity. I think this is clear. The diversity, the African ecological diversity vary from the north to the southern part of the continent. And to understand also the impact of demographic changes, urbanization, and agriculture on the land tenure system, and to address the need of harmonizing customary and statutory land management system. To focus, of course, on securing land and natural resources for marginalized groups, including women, disabled persons, indigenous people, pastoralists, and youth. To ensure that law is compatible with constitutional statutory safeguards, especially for women and land rights, and to acknowledge agriculture as a crucial element for socio-economic development, for food security and livelihood. And lately, to address rural poverty and technological infrastructure and market access challenges. So this chapter is leading to the conception of the third and fourth guideline. The third one is for the structures involved in the curriculum review or development process to acknowledge that the curriculum on land governance in the rural sectors need to ensure that land professionals have developed a deep understanding of the type of land tenure arrangement required to incentivize greater on farm investment. It should question how property right affects vulnerable groups' ability to participate in and benefit from agricultural development projects, and also highlight the type of complementary program necessary to incentivize climate-smart agricultural practice, as well as linkages between secure property right, and agricultural production. With regard to the guideline 4, the curriculum on land governance ought to pay attention to the promotion and understanding of the legitimacy of marginalized groups and indigenous land rights in Africa, viewed through the prism of human rights and how they relate to spirituality, cultural identity, and food security. So you see there's a kind of mixture of all these different topics, trying to defend the point of view that you cannot just understand land matters from one discipline per se. So, so it's important then to train professionals in mapping and zoning for agricultural land and rural land use planning, and to understand the potentials of responsible scale, large-scale agricultural investment to promote, of course, the application of principle for responsible and inclusive investment, and to develop skills for informed negotiation, because if you're not well informed, you will not be able to defend the point of view for a better land management in your locality, and to address, of course, the challenge of youth in their access to land, and also to create a lot of employment opportunities for these youth, to identify the gaps in youth access to land, to tenure security, and also to develop policies that enable you to acquire secure land rights. you do also know that this is one of the current challenges all over the continent, that youth are mostly migrating because they don't have access to land. So this leads us then to the guideline 5, that research to generate data and options for viable investment models in order to yield equitable outcome need to be integrated into governance curricula. In addition, curricula ought to guide trainings and skill development in the area of participatory land use planning and community development to ensure national security and rural livelihood as an integral part of responsible agricultural investment. And to the guideline 6, that it is essential that curricula on land governance ensure students and land professional ensure that students and land professionals have an in-depth understanding of the dynamic of pastoralism in the prevailing ecology, including the implication of changes in land use and access to pasture, water, and ultimately their livelihood. So we will then move to the next chapter on urban and peri-urban areas. Here we'll try to outline the key consideration to address for addressing the challenges and opportunities of rapid urbanization, informal settlement, land use planning, and how to finance urban development in the African context. So in regard to urban and peri-urban areas, it's important while you are developing or review your curricula to acknowledge the prevalence of informal settlement and slums in African cities. To address also the challenges in slum, including tenure security, poor living conditions, and limited access to service. And to incorporate, of course, curriculum elements that reflect the realities of urban and peri-urban life in Africa, and as well as to emphasize the importance of land use planning for sustainable and equitable urban development, and to recognize the need for a comprehensive urban and peri-urban use plan. And this leads us to the 7 guidelines, emphasizing that the curriculum should expose learners to programs that acquaint them with realities of urban and peri-urban settings in Africa, and therefore stimulate innovative solutions. And the guideline 8 emphasizes on the fact that it's important that curricula in land governance address the different ways of financing urban development in a sustainable manner. Learners how to be given the skills which are needed by public officers and government officials in order to apply innovative approaches while wide-ranging stakeholder in urban development projects. So now we'll go to this important topic of women's land rights. And hereby it's important to acknowledge that the women's contribution in the land and the curriculum review process, women's contribution to ensure equitable development benefit for all. So it's also close to this matter of marginalized group, and to explore best practices for strengthening women's land rights. We have some contexts in Africa whereby the process is quite improving. It would be good in the process of reviewing curriculum to also share these best practices in order to inspire other groups to learn out of it. So the curriculum review should, of course, or development should explore promising practices related to women's land rights, reflecting the diversity of the African continent and practices favorable to women. So on this topic of with women's land rights, it's important, of course, to recognize gender as a key determining factor for tenure security, and to understand, of course, gender-based power system or dynamics in the land governance system, and to develop a kind of gender-responsive approach in land governance via training and research provided. To focus, of course, on women land rights in curriculum development and to acknowledge women's critical role in socio-economic development and agriculture. So this leads us then to the guideline 9 that curriculum or curricular review on land governance in Africa should acknowledge women's contribution and ensure that all people, regardless of their sex range, benefit from our and or and are empowered by development policies and practices. And to guideline 10, uh, making evident that curriculum should expand the set of options and approaches and potential solutions for strengthening women's right to land by exploring promising practices related to women's land rights. This best practice should reflect the diversity of the African continent by including practices from specific traditional systems which are favorable to women. I will not go deeper. I will just go since I see Hannah. I think my time is coming to an end.
Yeah.
We are coming closely to an end. I will go to the guideline 11, which is mostly related to environment and climate change. And it's really important here to highlight that in this process, you should incorporate knowledge on environmental challenges that led to resources degradation or depletion due to poor land governance and actions for restoring the integrity of natural resources and environmental management. Because you know that the depletion of the resources will lead to land degradation, with poor agricultural practices, will lead to conflict, to access to the fertile land, to migration, and so on. So to the 12th one, it's also important to focus on climate change knowledge in relation to land management or to different practices, as I mentioned, and to also to highlight the efforts in agriculture and agroecological conservation actions and policies to be put in place to reduce the effect of greenhouse gas emission from agricultural system. The guideline 13 is mostly highlighting that land professionals need to understand the value of mapping, of land demarcation, delimitation, and also to highlight its effect on climate change, flood, and displaced population, as I mentioned also later on. So with regard to the conflict, it's also important to highlight the guideline 14 that it should prepare land professionals so that they are able to analyze the nature of the conflict in their areas of operation and be able to come up with some proper typology of land management system. And the 15, of course, should emphasize on the effect of conflict on communities, the social and economic well-being of the people, and how it undermines development. The 16 guideline is, of course, to include learning about land policies that are inclusive and take into account the various interests of our land that will contribute to the reduction of land-based conflict. The 17, we are coming to an end, Hannah. When land professionals are familiar with the various triggers of land-based conflict and how a dispute can be resolved, and in particular how alternative system and land dispute resolution can be made part of the national conflict resolution, they are able to perform their duties more efficiently. This is mostly an assumption. So with regard to the urbanization, it is necessary for land professionals to recognize and understand all forms of legitimate tenure arrangement, such as formal rights, customary tenure, and informal land tenure. And in the context-based curriculum or land governance are to pay particular attention to the uniqueness of context and the importance of adopting appropriate land administration processes. And the concept of the continuum of land rights supports a flexible way of looking at land tenure rights, and it allows a recordation of all type of people to land relation. When learners appreciate this flexibility of land tenure rights, they are better prepared to serve communities. The last one is on curricula on land governance, how to include trainings on the development of affordable and accessible land information system responsible to Africa unique circumstances. So I think I have managed to summarize the content of this huge toolkit. You can download this toolkit itself, the presentation or the videos on our homepage, nelga.unica.org. So over to you, Hannah, for the discussion. Thanks for your attention.